When peace feels unfamiliar, restoration begins here. This is Pipe Podcast. Welcome back to Pipe Podcast, Plug into Positive Energy. I'm your host, Kezia Mayfield. If you're new here, welcome. This is a place where we have honest conversations about healing, identity, relationships, and learning how to live again after life changes us. Today, I want to talk about disappointment. I don't know if anybody else does this, but my first answer is usually no. Not because I mean no, not because I don't want to, but because somewhere along the way, disappointment taught me how to hesitate before I had hope. Years ago, someone asked me, "Why do you always say no first?" I didn't have an answer then, but I do now. That no was not really a no. It was protection. Because if I got excited immediately, if I believed something good was about to happen, then what if it didn't? What if I got my hopes up? What if it all fell apart again? Looking back, I realized I wasn't preparing for success. I was preparing for disappointment. And eventually, you do it for so long that it just becomes normal. You stop expecting God to move. You stop expecting good things. You stop getting excited. You stop asking what could go right, and you start asking what could go wrong. It becomes your default setting. And I think that's where I've lived for a long time. Recently, we started moving forward with IVF, and I had finally gotten to a place where I was willing to have hope, willing to believe maybe this was part of our story. Then 3 days into stimulation, everything changed. Suddenly, there were financial questions, there were insurance questions, decisions that needed immediate answers. Before I knew it, I was standing in uncertainty once again. With no plan, no answers, no control. And all of those old thoughts just started showing back up. What if this is it? What if it never happens? What if this is just another disappointment? Maybe that's what disappointment does. It convinces us that the current moment is the final chapter. It will tell you that today's uncertainty will be tomorrow's outcome. But it isn't. Not usually. The truth is, I have experienced disappointment in so many different areas of my life. As a wife, as a friend, as a daughter, and especially as a mother. One of the hardest parts of divorce has been accepting that I can't control everything my children experience. I can't control every environment, every influence, or every decision. And as a parent, that is so incredibly painful, because if love alone could protect our children, none of them would ever hurt. For years, while my ex-husband traveled, I wasn't just mom. I was everything. I was the comforter and the disciplinarian, the rule maker, the one who always had to say no. And sometimes that's a really lonely place to live. I've had moments where my children have said things that have just broken my heart. Moments where I've questioned myself. Moments where I wondered if I had failed. Moments where disappointment settled really deep into my heart. But if I'm being completely honest, the greatest disappointment I've ever experienced, it wasn't with someone else. It was with myself. I thought I could survive anything. I thought I could carry everything. I thought I could stay in difficult situations forever. I thought strength meant enduring no matter what. Then one day, I found my limit. I couldn't keep carrying everything. I couldn't keep pretending I was okay. And when I finally left, I felt like I had failed. Not because leaving was wrong, but because my identity had become wrapped up in being the person who could handle anything. I thought strength meant staying. God was teaching me that sometimes strength looks like telling the truth. Sometimes strength looks like admitting you're hurt. Sometimes strength looks like complete surrender. A couple weeks ago, I attended a retreat. And honestly, it was one of the most healing weekends I've been able to experience in a really long time. At the end of it, they gave us these packages filled with letters from people who loved us. And I opened mine and I started reading letter after letter with encouragement, so much support and kindness. I could feel their love for me. Then I realized one letter was missing. There was one person I had hoped had written me. One person I wanted to hear from. And their letter wasn't there. And for a moment, I completely fell apart. Not because of the 10 letters I had received. I was grateful for those. But it was for the one I didn't. As I sat there crying, I felt Jesus ask me something. Are you really going to let this one thing that you didn't receive steal everything that I've already given you? And that question hit me really hard. Because the truth was, I wasn't upset about the letter. The letter was just exposing something deeper. Disappointment had trained my eyes. It had trained me to focus on what was missing, what wasn't there, what didn't happen, what I didn't get. And because I was focused on what I lacked, I was missing everything God had already placed in my hands. And that reminds me of Peter. We often focus on Peter denying Jesus. We focus on Peter sinking in the water. We focus on Peter's failures. But Jesus knew every mistake Peter would make and chose him anyways. Peter doubted. Peter failed. Peter denied Christ 3 times. Yet, Jesus still said, "Upon this rock, I will build my church." Jesus didn't build his church on Peter's perfection. He built it on Peter's testimony, his restoration, his redemption, his willingness to keep coming back. Maybe some of us have spent so much time focusing on our disappointments that we've forgotten what God has already said about us. We have forgotten who we are. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I found myself asking a question I had never really thought about before. Was Jesus ever disappointed? Not disappointment because he didn't know what was coming. He knew Judas would betray him. He knew Peter would deny him. He knew people would walk away. But I do believe he experienced heartbreak. When Jesus looked over Jerusalem and said, "How often I wanted to gather you together, but you were unwilling," you can hear the grief in those words. When Lazarus died, Jesus knew he was about to raise him from the dead. And yet, he still wept for his friend. And even in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." Jesus never pretended pain didn't hurt. He never numbed himself. He never ignored it. He felt it. He grieved it. He brought it to the Father. And maybe that's the difference. Maybe the question isn't whether Jesus experienced disappointment. Maybe the question is what he did with it. Because Jesus never let his disappointment become his identity. He never let disappointment determine who he was. And he never let disappointment change what he believed about his Father. And I think that's what I'm learning too. Not how to avoid disappointment, not how to pretend it doesn't hurt, but how to bring it somewhere. How to bring it to Jesus instead of carrying it alone. One of the greatest gifts God has given me over the last few years is teaching me how to sit with Jesus. Whenever I meet with him, it's always in the same place. It's a small fishing boat, dark water, thousands of stars reflecting on the surface. Jesus will be sitting directly across from me, close enough I can feel his knees. And then I just began to tell him everything. All of my fears, all of my disappointments, all of my grief. And even the hopes I barely want to say out loud. The funny thing is, I have pretty bad ADD, and my mind wanders constantly. I'll be talking to him, and then suddenly I'm thinking about bills. I'm thinking about IVF. I'm thinking about my kids. my work, what I'm going to cook for dinner. I just start thinking about life. And every time I hear Jesus say the same thing. Look at me. Keep your eyes on me. Focus. Look at me. It's going to be okay. And isn't that exactly what happened with Peter? As long as Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he walked on water. The moment he focused on the storm, he began to sink. And maybe disappointment isn't the storm. Maybe disappointment is what happens when we become more aware of the storm than we do our Savior. I don't think disappointment is what hurts us the most. I think it's what disappointment convinces us to look at. Because when I focus on what I've lost, I lost sight of what God is still doing. Maybe healing isn't learning how to avoid disappointment. Maybe healing is learning how to return our focus again and again and again. Because life will disappoint us. People will absolutely disappoint us. Plans will disappoint us. But Jesus never asked us to put our hope in any of those things. He asked us to put our eyes on Him. And I think that's what I'm learning. Not how to avoid disappointment. Not how to control the outcomes. I'm learning to hope again. When I was a little girl, I would sit in the middle seat of my parents' minivan when we would travel to go hear my dad preach. And I used to ask him the same question almost every time. Dad, what do you think Jesus is going to do this weekend? I always expected him to show up. I expected Jesus to change lives. I expected miracles. I expected God to move. Somewhere along the way, disappointment replaced expectation. And I stopped asking that question. But maybe it's time to ask again. Maybe it's time to stop preparing for disappointment and start expecting God. Not because life is easy. Not because every prayer gets answered the way we would want. But because God is still good. God is still present. God is still speaking. God is still moving. And maybe the greatest healing of all isn't getting everything we hoped for. Maybe it's becoming the kind of person who can hope again anyway. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Before you go, I want to leave you with one question. What have you stopped expecting God to do? Not because He can't. Not because He won't. But because disappointment convinced you to stop believing He would. Maybe this week, instead of preparing for disappointment, we can start looking for evidence that God is still moving. Because I have a feeling He's doing more than we realize. And maybe that's where hope begins. Not in certainty, not in outcomes, but in trusting that even when we can't see it, God is still at work. And always, remember, what you're connected to will either build your life or it will drain it. Choose wisely. I'll see you next week. Thank you for sitting with us today, where restoration begins.